Fear is a powerful motivator. It can cause folks to act in ways that they would otherwise not normally act. Fear can cause us to engage in some of the most heinous acts of cruelty and hatred. Fear can cause us to 1 minute love our neighbor and in the very next breath hate our neighbor. We become fearful of the things that we don't understand. We become fearful of the things we don't know. We are fearful of things that are different from us. We are fearful of the other. We are fearful of folks who don't look like us, live like us, or act like us. We are fearful of folks who don't worship the same God that we worship. I suspect this is why it's easy for us to support legislation and public policy that justifies our fears of the other. Recently, two ballot measures were for the November 2026 Colorado ballot. One is called the Protect Women and Girls in Sports Act, and the second prohibits gender affirming care for minors. As you can imagine, both target our transgender neighbors and friends. On this week's episode of Faithful Witness with Terrence Carroll, we'll talk about them and similar proposals and legislation around the country. Welcome to this week's episode of Faithful Witness with Terrence Carroll. I'm Terrence Carroll, a pastor, a public theologian, a lawyer, and former Speaker of the Colorado House. Faithful Witness is rooted in the prophetic tradition of the Black church, and each week we explore the moral questions shaping our democracy, culture, and society. If you like what you hear, if you want to help me grow this channel more, please make sure that you like, subscribe, share, tell your friends about it. Now to this week's episode. Recently, two ballot measures qualified in Colorado for the November 2026 ballot. They're both based on the premise that they want to protect our society by putting guardrails around how transgender people can show up in society. The first one would prohibit transgender girls from participating in sports, women's sports in Colorado. The second one says that minors, that's those people under the age of 18, would not allowed to be provided with gender affirming surgery in the state of Colorado. The proponents of these measures argue that they're necessary to protect our children from harm, to protect our children from danger. They're based on our fear because they argue that transgender girls are overrunning women's sports in Colorado, and it's creating an unfair and an unequal playing ground. And the second measure is premised on the idea that somewhere, somehow, there's this vast conspiracy to rush children under the age of 18 into the surgery suite to receive gender affirming surgery. Both these measures are grounded in anecdote and fear that somewhere in Colorado there are hordes of transgendered athletes taking over women's sports and forcing cisgender females out. And the second one is based on this wild idea that parents and doctors and other folks are forcing minor kids into the surgery suite to receive gender affirming care. Based on my time in the Colorado General Assembly, we always got the worst public policy when that public policy was grounded in fear and was grounded in anecdote presented as fact and truth. Because when you have anecdote grounded in fear, it causes folks to take extreme measures. It causes folks to forget the target of that legislation based on fear and anecdote are human beings as well. Before we dig deeper into the rationale and the purpose of these ballot measures and legislation that's proliferating around the country targeting our transgender neighbors, our transgendered fellow sojourners on this earth, I want to do a little level setting on the facts related to the transgender population in the United States, the number of transgender people who are receiving gender affirming surgery, especially minors. And I want to talk about, is there really an invasion, as some would put it, of transgender athletes, especially transgender women, taking over women's athletics? I like to say, when I conclude this podcast, to tell the truth, seek justice, and love the people. And part of telling the truth and seeking justice and loving the people is making sure that when we're dealing with sensitive topics, highly polarized and politicized topics, that as much as we can, that we operate from a common set of facts. And thankfully for us, there's a vast resource of data that we can pull from regarding the transgender population in the United States. Only about 1% of the total U.S. population over the age of 13 identifies as transgender. That equates to about 2.8 million people out of our huge population that resides here in the United States. When it comes to high school athletes, fewer than 122,000 high school students are transgender. Yet, we have 29 states that have transgender sports bans, and 3 states, including Colorado, have bans on the ballot in 2026, all for 122,000 students. And by the way, if you want more facts, there's a link in the show note to my column this week on my Substack channel, Faithful Witness with Terrence Carroll. It makes it easy for everyone. And there's a link to that column where I have far more facts and figures that you can look at. And when it comes to gender affirming surgery bans that like those proposed in Colorado and that I believe some 29 other states already have, they're based on this idea that we have kids, and we've heard the arguments made, straight face arguments made, that in schools they're trying to turn our kids into transgender. We have parents who are trying to turn our kids into transgender, making them go get surgeries. And I'm not making this up. I shouldn't even say really. I am not making this up. All you have to do is go Google the arguments made by folks who somehow believe that transgender folks in this country are now the greatest threat to the American way of life. So again, let me go back to gender affirming bans. First of all, gender affirming surgery for minors is exceptionally rare. According to the best practices put forth by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health and other medical professionals, they do not recommend providing surgery, gender affirming surgery, until the age of 18 except under certain circumstances that have to do with exceptional risk to the life of the person seeking gender affirming surgery. When it comes to kids the age of 13 to 17, there are fewer than 1,100 to 1,400 surgeries per year nationwide, and no surgery performed on children under the age of 12. Most, if not all, medical facilities, surgical centers will not perform a gender affirming surgery under the age of 18. So, if the facts don't support these claims, why? Why have we seen this great increase of bills and legislation and ballot measures targeting transgender individuals and the transgender community, especially since 2020? The answer is plain and simple: it's fear. It's being used as a wedge issue for folks to promote their religious doctrine and teachings and ideology on the rest of us as an effort to gain power and control over our democracy and make our democracy look and act like their religious beliefs. If this was truly about public safety and public health of our children, why do we have legislation like in Tennessee, which now, if it passes, would require healthcare providers to report detailed information on patients receiving gender affirming care? In Idaho, there's legislation making its way through their House and Senate right now that would impose civil penalties of up to $100,000 on teachers, counselors, and other adults who fail to report students who aren't conforming to traditional gender stereotypes. I have lots of questions about what do they perceive to be a traditional gender stereotype. I could see all sorts of abuse coming from this. In Kansas, there is a new policy that requires their transgender residents to surrender their driver's licenses if the gender on their license does not match the gender they were assigned at birth. What is the motivation for all of this? Again, if it's been debunked that we have these large number of transgender athletes taking over sports, if it's not true that we have our surgical suites being overrun with children being forced to have gender affirming surgery, then what is it? Before we move on, I want to put some context around this and provide you some insight as to the lens through which I'm viewing this. If you've been watching or listening to my podcast for some time now, you know that I'm an ordained Baptist minister and that my faith in Christ is incredibly important to me. That I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus walked this earth, that Jesus was crucified, and on the third day he rose with all power and glory in his hands. And because of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, that I have salvation. And that is all available to me through the grace and the mercy and the love that Jesus Christ extended to a poor, broken sinner like me. But I also believe that in the public square, my faith, how I understand my relationship with Christ, should not have any primacy over anyone else. And in fact, when it comes to the Christian faith, even among those of us who call ourselves theologically orthodox, there is still great debate about gender roles, gender identity, or as some folks say, biblical sexuality. I'm not going to get into right now because that's outside the scope of what I want to talk about today. But I say all that to get back to my original point that one of the most important aspects historically and traditionally of the Baptist church is the idea of the separation of church and state. Because the minute we start allowing the state to dictate what proper religious practice is, there's a problem. And when we start, as people of faith, to want to impose our will, our religious will, on others through the apparatus of the state, we have a problem. It defiles faith. It defiles our belief in God because we say we are going to step into the role of God and impose our will, our faith on others until they believe exactly as we do. That's not faith. That's ideology. That says you don't really believe in democracy because you think that in order for you to win in democracy, you have to impose your will on others. You don't completely trust that God really meant that we're all created in God's image and likeness because you want to erase some people. And that's what these ballot measures are about. That's what this legislation that's being pushed all around the country is about. It's about saying that a certain group of folks within our society do not have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness because we don't like who they are. Because we've decided that because of the way they show up in the world, we want to marginalize them. We want to oppress them. We want to other them. And your faith, in my opinion, is I don't want to speak on behalf of everyone's faith, but my faith does not require me to impose my theological, my religious beliefs, my religious practices on the rest of the world, on everyone else, in order for me to feel okay about my worship. In fact, my Jesus told me that they shall know you by your love. My Jesus, in telling me to go make disciples of the world, told me to lead with love. And I take that command very seriously, to lead with love. This morning, as I was doing my morning devotion, I happened to stumble across it. I don't know if I should say stumble because it was what was next in order with Luke. And this is after Jesus had preached about the Beatitudes in chapter 6. He's talking about who's blessed. And then he says, love your enemies. And then he talks about who to love and why to love them. And he did not exclude anyone from the list of folks to love. As I look at these measures, this is not about love. This is about hatred. This is about fear. And one of the most radical things about Christianity, in fact, I will say the most radical thing about Christianity is this command to love. And it's radical because it's much harder to love than it is to live in fear. It's much harder to love than it is to be hateful because fear and hate play on our most base instincts. As people of faith living in democracy, I reject the notion that the way we show up in the world is premised on who we don't love. I reject the notion that the way we participate in democracy is premised on who we think is unworthy. Not one of us has escaped the stain of sin. And to act like we're somehow better than others is anathema to the gospel. But I digress. I want to get back to why this is problematic. And I go into greater detail on this in my Substack column again in the show notes. This is problematic and why all Christians, whether you believe in traditional gender roles, all people of faith where you agree or have some notion of what traditional sexuality is, should stand up for transgender rights because the assault on transgender people based on religious ideology is a threat to the religious freedom of all of us. Because if we follow the logic of many of these proponents, and most, if not all, of the proponents of these types of measures say that they're informed by their religious beliefs. If we allow public policy to be made based on the religious beliefs of one group of people to the exclusion of others, that means that none of us are safe in our hearth and our home. Our conscience is not safe because it will be dictated by government and by those who have chosen to use their religious beliefs through the power of the government to impose those beliefs on the rest of us. I want to bring up George Washington, and you know, I'm always hesitant to bring up the founders because they all are problematic in their own way. George Washington, a whole lot of them, but their fundamental view based on Enlightenment principles still stands and is still valid. In 1719, George Washington wrote a letter to a Jewish synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, in response to their fear that religious freedom would not be upheld in this new democracy called the United States of America. In this letter, George Washington says that the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. George Washington then goes on to say that religious freedom is not a matter of toleration as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. This is the basis of what I have coined our democratic covenant. And that democratic covenant is formed in the Declaration of Independence, that we respect each other's human dignity, that we respect each other's rights, that we expect each other's ability, as George Washington talks about when referencing the book of Micah, that we're each able to lay under our own fig tree and not be bothered by anyone else, and that we seek out the common good for all of us and not try to impose our own personal piety, our own notions of personal piety on one another. But in this great society of different ideas and ideologies and religious beliefs, that we all find a way to work out in dialogue an American democratic experiment that benefits us all and allows us all to live together in a way that we all can rest under our own fig tree without fear of being attacked, marginalized, oppressed, and othered by anyone else. And this democratic covenant protects us all, the religious and the non-religious, from the state's coercive power in matters of conscience. Efforts both at our federal government, at the state level, and in the local level, to control, to confine, to erase our transgender neighbors is a violation of that democratic covenant. It's an absolute violation of their ability to find shade under that fig tree and live their life as they see fit. This is one of the most important doctrines of Baptist teaching on religious freedom, as they see fit in the eyes of God. And to the extent that they have a God or no God, to answer to whatever deity or divine authority or to the limits of their own personal conscience freely. Until you tell me and explain more clearly how being transgender is a violation of our civil order, I am compelled to reject your arguments. I am compelled to stand against you in your efforts to erase members of our society who are created in God's image. I am compelled to reject your efforts to impose your religious beliefs on the rest of us, because that is not how democracy is supposed to work. I come from people who've been the subject of government action to strip our identity, the subject of government action to erase us from history. In fact, the current administration is in the process of trying to erase us from the history of the United States. And because I come from a group that's been marginalized, I feel that I have a moral, ethical, and theological responsibility to stand on the side of any other group that's been targeted by those in power for erasure and for marginalization. Hard stop. I want to close with this quote by Audre Lorde. It's not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. Thanks for watching this week's episode of Faithful Witness with Terrence Carroll. Remember to tell the truth, seek justice, and love the people.